Valentine's Day is traditionally a day when lovers express their affection with greetings, which is an odd way to celebrate what started as a liturgical feast for a decapitated Christian martyr. But perhaps even more ironic is the story of the first Valentine, which was written by a man who was imprisoned, lamenting his separation from his love with the decidedly unromantic line, "I am already sick of love." The story of the first Valentine is really a thrilling story that includes a mad king, one of history's greatest battles, and poetry. It is a complex tale that involves two great kingdoms and all the machinations of a royal court, part Shakespearean sonnet, part Game of Thrones. All history that deserves to be remembered. Make no mistake, the story of the first Valentine is a story of love. But it is a tangled story that includes all the dramatic elements and the most lurid tales of love. Jealousy, lust, greed, a feud between families, assassination, war, and even madness. As a certain English playwright once wrote, "For aught that I could ever read, could ever hear by tale or history, the course of true love never did run smooth." It's often said that love is a form of madness, so it's fitting that the story of the first Valentine would start there. In this case, the madness of a king. Charles VI of France was the son of King Charles V and the Queen Consort, Joanna of Bourbon. His father died in 1380 when Charles was just 11 years old, and his uncles, his father's brothers, were made regents. Power fell largely to his uncle Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. It was a difficult time in France. The nation had never recovered from the devastation of the Black Plague, which had struck between 1547 and 1552. The plague killed a third of the population of Paris, so many that it was said that there were not enough living to bury the dead. The royal house of Valois was in the midst of a more than century-long conflict with the English royal house of Plantagenet over the throne of France, a conflict called the 100 Years' War. Taxes to support the war had led to disaffection among the working class and frequent revolt. During his minority, his uncles squandered the kingdom's resources for their personal gain. Although the legal age of majority was 14, Charles was only able to take control from his uncle and terminate the regency at age 21. At first, he was able to restore careful management through the help of his father's advisors and earned the sobriquet, the Beloved. But insanity ran in his mother's family. Charles would go through bouts of true madness. The first episode was in 1392, when on a military expedition he became confused and thought he was being attacked by assassins. He killed several of his own guards before finally being subdued. While he had times of lucidity, he had frequent bouts of delusion. At times he would forget his own name, and other times he could not recognize his close associates, or even his wife. He suffered from bouts of glass man insanity, becoming convinced that he was made of glass and could easily be shattered. It's unclear from what illness he truly suffered. Some modern scholars think that it was paranoid schizophrenia, but others think it might have been a neurological disorder that's called neurosarcoidosis. But it was clear that Charles the Beloved was really Charles the Mad. Philip, seeing opportunity, immediately took control, declaring himself regent over the Mad King. But this upset the king's brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, who considered himself next in line. Louis was the leader of the powerful House of Orleans. He was a notorious womanizer and was reported to be the cause of the fire in the famous Ball of the Burning Men, the subject of another episode of The History Guy. The two were competing for power and, more importantly, for control over the treasury. But Charles the Mad made his own contribution to the jealous fight for power. In a period of lucidity, he made his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, the guardian of their children, giving her control over the heirs and thus making her the center of power. Charles and Isabeau had been married in 1385 with the support of Philip as a way to build an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor against England. In an irony, however, mutual exhaustion led to a movement for peace with England, and in an effort to secure that peace, in 1396 Charles and Isabeau married their 6-year-old daughter, Isabella, to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. Queen Isabeau thus became a fulcrum in the jealous fight between the houses of Burgundy and Orleans over power and money. This contest did not just affect France. In 1399, Louis managed to wrest control in the power struggle. Louis realized that Philip benefited from the peace with England, and he held lands in the Low Countries that were dependent upon the English textile trade. Louis reasoned that friction with England would hurt Philip, and he had a means to cause friction. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard II's cousin, had a falling out with the English king and had been banished to France. When he asked permission to return to England in 1399, Louis allowed it. Henry would then successfully lead a revolt against Richard, culminating in Richard's imprisonment and eventual murder. Henry became Henry IV, King of England, and among other implications it meant that Charles and Isabeau's daughter, Isabella, became a widow at just the age of 10. Sensing opportunity, Louis married his 10-year-old niece, the former Queen of England and daughter of the King and Queen of France, to his 12-year-old son, Charles, her first cousin. The contest between Burgundy and Orleans took a major turn when, in 1404, Philip died, making his son John Duke of Burgundy. This led to an extreme shift in power. Unlike Philip, John was not the son of a king, nor did he have the personal connection to Isabeau. As a further intrigue, as power started to shift towards Louis, a rumor spread that Louis had begun an affair with Isabeau. As he gained power, Louis purged John's supporters from the Regent Council and used the treasury to take control of lands claimed by John. The two played a bizarre game where they successfully kidnapped and rescued Charles and Isabeau's children. Despite his madness, they had 12 offspring. The two began lobbing public threats. Trying to prevent civil war, their uncle, the Duke of Berry, negotiated a public peace, but just 3 days later, on November 23, 1406, John had Louis murdered. As he was going to see the king, he was attacked by 15 masked men who murdered him, splitting his skull with an axe. As Louis was unpopular, John did not even hide his crime, instead having a supporter from the academic community deliver an address, claiming the assassination was needed to prevent tyranny. And yes, this assassination, the result of jealousy and greed over power in the wake of the king's madness, would eventually lead to the world's first Valentine. And that all has to do with the man who composed that Valentine, Charles, who upon the death of his father became the new Duke of Orleans. Becoming Duke at just the age of 14, Charles not only inherited the rivalry between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy, but also the burden that his father had been openly murdered, and his murderer had faced no penalty. His mother, Valentia of Milan, died only a year after Louis, and at her funeral Charles was made to swear an oath to avenge his father's death. That oath would result in civil war. Isabella had died in childbirth in 1406, and in 1410 Charles married Beaune of Armagnac, daughter of a powerful noble, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac. At the time, Beaune was just 11 and Charles was 16. The marriage brought together a number of powerful families, including the Dukes of Berry, Bourbon, and Brittany, and they pledged to oppose the Burgundians under John. With Bernard essentially taking control of the Orleans faction, they became known as the Armagnacs. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War would eventually last nearly 30 years, occasionally punctuated by periods of peace. The Civil War was also punctuated by periods of lucidity on behalf of the king, who supported both sides at different times, as well as periods of essentially chaos where supporters of either side seemed to be out of control. Among the many results was that in England, King Henry V, son of Henry IV, whom Louis, Duke of Orleans, had helped take power, saw an opportunity to exploit the division within France, and invaded. In his campaign in 1415, Henry V, having taken the port of Harfleur by siege, decided to march his army cross-country to Calais. The French army was able to intercept him near the village of Agincourt. John of Burgundy was in a difficult position, unwilling to align with the English as that would have destroyed his reputation in France, but also loath to join with the Armagnacs. In the end, he offered only token support, and his troops did not participate in the celebrated battle. The French at Agincourt were mostly Armagnacs, among them Charles, Duke of Orleans, then just 21 years old. Much has been written about the Battle of Agincourt, and there has been modern disagreement regarding the relative size of the armies, but Henry V's band of brothers, despite being greatly outnumbered, won a decisive victory, killing as many as 6,000 French, many of them nobles, and capturing 1,000 more. Among those captured was the Duke of Orleans, who was found uninjured but buried beneath a group of corpses. The French had been so packed together that they often could not even raise their arms to fight. While many of the captured nobles were offered ransom, Henry forbade ransom for Charles, as he was in the line of succession for the throne of France. While the conditions of his imprisonment were not strict, he was held and prevented from returning home for 24 years. In his confinement, he became a poet. During his imprisonment, he composed more than 500 poems in both French and English. In his first year of imprisonment, he wrote a poem to his wife, Beaune, who was just 16 at the time, called Farewell to Love. It is considered to be history's first Valentine. I am already sick of love, my very gentle Valentine, since for me you were born too soon, and I for you was born too late. God forgives he who has estranged me from you for the whole year. I am already sick of love, my very gentle Valentine. For a note of love, it bore the tragedy of events that had taken him there. Charles wrote many more love poems to his wife while in captivity. Beaune of Armagnac, for whom he clearly bore genuine love, died during his captivity. They would never see each other again. So in case you need a recap, the madness of the King of France led to a power struggle between his brother and his uncle, which led to his brother's assassination, which led to a civil war between his nephew and his cousin, which resulted in an invasion by the English that caused a battle in which his nephew was captured and, while held prisoner, became a poet and so wrote the world's first Valentine. And no, I don't think that Hallmark has ever come up with like a poem that was small enough to fit inside a card that makes sense of any of that. In 1418, John the Fearless of Burgundy invaded Paris and executed a massacre of Armagnac's supporters, killing between 1,000 and 5,000, including Bernard VII, the Count of Armagnac. A year later, John was assassinated by an Armagnac supporter. After his victory, Henry V was married to King Charles and Queen Isabeau's daughter Catherine, and named heir to the throne of France. But before he could take the throne, Henry died before Charles, and Charles' son, Charles VII, became king, continuing the 100 Years' War. Catherine would then marry one of Henry V's knights, and their grandson, Henry VII, would found England's Tudor dynasty. Charles, Duke of Orleans, the man who composed the world's first Valentine, was finally released and allowed to return to France in 1440. There, at the age of 46, he married a 16-year-old German princess. He passed away in 1465 at the age of 70. Their son, Louis of Orleans, would become King of France in 1498, when King Charles the Mad's great-grandson, Charles VIII, died without heir. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.